So how did you get to publishing a book on tactical urbanism, and what was your journey?
So the idea for tactical urbanism came from observing how both community activists and a few cities during the Great Recession were coming up with very creative and low-cost projects that were actually quickly leading to more sustained investments. And so I got really enamored with this idea that the planning profession didn't have to wait for years and years and years to make changes to streets and public spaces and to enhance neighborhood living. And so I collected a bunch of case studies from good examples from around the world, and I kind of packaged it together and gave it the term tactical urbanism, kind of explained the kind of the values behind it and the meaning behind that term. And that first digital publication, which we released for free on the internet, was downloaded way more than we expected and kind of went viral, so to speak, as much as a planning document can. And that led to a second volume, and then collaborations with other people internationally to calibrate the idea and the examples to different countries around the world. And then in 2015, we kind of took all the 4 or 5 years of both practicing it as street plans and then researching and learning from others to create the first tactical urbanism book, which was published by Island Press.
That's really interesting to hear. And just wondering if there was kind of a particular moment when you thought, right, now's the time to write a book, or what the kind of moment was where you thought, like, something needs to be kind of created about this?
Well, I think the idea that we presented in 2011 with the first volume of the guide, it really created the seed, but we weren't ready at that point to really kind of define what this movement was all about. And we certainly didn't have great examples that illustrated the methodology in as complete a way as we want. In fact, I would argue that, I wish we'd kind of written the book this year as opposed to 2015, because the movement has continued to really expand and evolve so much. And so we're actually going to be doing a second edition at some point in the near future. But, we had to kind of really practice for 3 or 4 years. In fact, by 2014 was the first time we even saw a tender put out by a government agency asking explicitly for tactical urbanism. And so that work barely made it into the book that was published a year later because it was just so fresh and so new. So it was really important, I think, for us just to better understand and learn from others and learn from our own work how we could put this into a book that was worth reading.
Great, thank you. That's great to hear. And so following on from that then, across the world during COVID-19, we've seen kind of communities coming together, finding a renewed appreciation for their local space. What key lessons do you think people have learned from tactical urbanism during COVID-19?
I think people have learned that, we as human beings put lots of regulations and rules around how we operate our streets and public spaces in our cities. And a lot of those rules have been in place for a very long time. But just as humans created those rules with good intentions, maybe perhaps many years ago, I think we've learned during the crisis that those rules can be undone and we can go in a completely different direction and act actually very quickly. And so governments, which are long thought to be slow-moving, animals, have been very nimble in relative terms to allow for a lot of these changes to be made. And it's obviously created this impetus for, thinking about space differently and what space is used for and how it's used in our cities, which are inherently space constrained. So that's been a big lesson. I think it's also a really important lesson that we've seen the major inequities play out in our cities during the crisis on who already had access to nice parks and public spaces and place to recreate and get, a recharge on their mental health versus those who did not. And it turns out that a lot of the places that did not have been more susceptible to the spread of the virus and have had poor health outcomes or had poor health outcomes already, part of which can be attributed to lack of access to open space and safe streets and things of that nature. So that's been put under a magnifying glass even more so than it was pre-pandemic.
Definitely. Yeah, definitely here in the UK as well. So how do you believe that we could use tactical urbanism as a tool to move forward into 2021, kind of coming out of this post-pandemic environment where things have been able to move quickly? Do you think that's something that tactical urbanism will be able to kind of continue this momentum?
Yeah, I think that's going to be, to use the common phrase, that's going to be essential. I think from like an economic standpoint, it's going to be really critical that restaurants and cafes and pubs have been able to more completely operate outdoors, let's say, just to survive when there's been indoor limitations. Once they come back online, and hopefully they survive this winter, once the pandemic is receding, they're really going to need that space to operate to recover all that was lost during the pandemic financially. And it turns out that actually provides a huge amount of benefit to the liveliness of our streets and our neighborhoods. And so not just with restaurants, but really rethinking how services and retailing and markets and restaurants and trading can all happen, between buildings, not just inside of them, is going to be a critical part of recovering the economy. And I think just from a mobility perspective, moving more people more efficiently through buses, cycling, and walking is going to be a really important part of getting the economy back up and running and making sure people are getting to where they need to go safely and have more options at which to do that. And a lot of new patterns and new I would say routines are being created right now. The longer these lockdowns and the longer the pandemic has stretched, the more people have altered the way they do get around. And so, for example, here in New York, we've seen a huge cycling boom, and I think you've seen that in London and other places as well, where some of that's definitely going to stick around. People are just going to say, that's how I get to work now, that's how I get to the park, that's how I get to the high street, and we're going to see that continue. And so that'll be a really important part of the public health and the mobility question, I think, moving forward.
Yeah, I think the situation in Brighton, UK, which is where I live, kind of really resonates with that, because obviously there's this idea of building back better post COVID-19, and I think people aren't willing. They've seen how things can be and how beneficial more space for cycle lanes and walkways is, and now they don't want it to move back. So yeah, that's been really interesting here as well. So in your book, you talk about how tactical urbanism is short-term action for long-term change. Just wondering what you think the challenges and opportunities are for tactical urbanism projects to move from low-cost short-term interventions to being established more permanently, kind of within the built environment itself, or integrated within city policy.
That's a great question. There's a couple of things that come to mind. One, cities make it very difficult for themselves or for people in the neighborhood to just engage with the shortest of short-term projects. Yeah. So I think one of the easier things that cities could do is to create policies and programs that allow community groups or local businesses, advocacy organizations, or city agencies to go out and try things for a day, for a week, like as an activation, as a form of engagement, to show people an idea that's being considered by council. Making that easy is only going to make it easier for councils to reach their longer term, climate goals, economic goals, public health goals. And so getting that to happen is really critical. But then that question of what do you do when you've had a successful demonstration project or a successful pilot project? Oftentimes that's where cities fail. They fail to kind of connect the short term to the long term through a pipeline of project delivery, of development, of making sure what the next step is once you've had a successful go at a project in the short term. Not let it languish, to make sure there's maintenance available. How would that then get considered as public works moving forward in the longer term, with permanent materials and permanent partnerships in place to maintain the infrastructure and the changes. So those are two really big pieces. One is certainly a lot easier on the front end, the first example, but the second example is something that councils and cities have to take very seriously and figure out how to stage the projects into more permanent implementation when there's success. And what we recommend is that there's really three ways to do that. There's the demonstration project, which is again more about community outreach and engagement, uncovering ideas for communities who don't think about this stuff day to day like we do. Mm-hmm. And then there's pilots, which really test something from a performance perspective, and those are typically can be as short as a month, sometimes a year or two. And then there's this piece called interim design. That's really the critical piece, is when you have those successful demonstrations or pilots. The interim piece can still be flexible, can still be relatively low cost, can allow for you to continue to learn and adapt a long-term infrastructure investment. But that piece of it's really critical to kind of bridge that gap between the pilot and the longer term, work. And most cities won't move within 3 years to do that. Sometimes that's 5, 10, or 20 years. And so that interim piece becomes really important.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear that kind of contextual background information around the behind the scenes things that are going on with those projects, going from short-term to long-term change. Following on from that, in terms of the people who are involved in these projects, in tactical urbanism projects, so given they're usually low cost and often citizen-led, it's a very different approach to urban change than is often taken by traditional urban planning community engagement practices like consultation meetings, things like that. So how do you think tactical urbanism can diversify the voices who have a say in shaping their city spaces?
Yeah, tactical urbanism as an engagement methodology or approach is really powerful because it's not meant to replace consultation and community meetings, and whatnot. But those, as you know, those meetings really only attract a certain type of demographic, and a lot of people lose out on the questions that are being asked there and also answered. And so the demonstration project in particular is great because it's so public, it's on the street, it's where people already are in their daily life. You can intercept folks and they can be educated about an initiative that's going on, they can ask questions, they can give you really quick hyper feedback of I hate this, I love this. All that can be really valuable just to get a more complete sense of where community is and its needs and what they would like to see happen to make the neighborhood and city more livable. And so by doing that publicly and doing that physically and with experiential changes, you get a much more accurate read on, I think, on how a community feels about the potential for their streets and their neighborhood.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really interesting to hear that perspective. So obviously being a really successful tactical placemaker, you've had lots of successes, but also with all your experience, you'll know that mistakes happen along the way. And sometimes in order to create change, you need to learn from mistakes. I was wondering if you could tell us about a time when something didn't quite go to plan and what you learned from this or how you overcame it.
I would say every project has some aspect of that for sure. Trying to think of a good example. Actually, I can give you a COVID example. We were working on a project in a smaller city in Western Massachusetts. So that's a state in the Northeast of the United States. And it was actually a long-term project to reconstruct their high street over quite a long distance. And we were hired to present a demonstration of what some of the options might be at a relatively small scale. And the pandemic happened, and we were very unsure if we could actually do that work. It was up in the air whether or not we could safely get people together, as we do with volunteers and community groups, and go out and transform the street. But then the pandemic really receded this summer, and particularly in Massachusetts. And the city received a very large grant from the state of Massachusetts that was designed for COVID response in streets and public spaces. So all of a sudden we had a lot more resources to work with, which was great from the standpoint of we could do more length of this treatment. And so this is a very wide street and very confusing and one of the more dangerous streets in this part of the state to cross on foot. And so it became very clear that we could make a big impact. And so we went through our process and had very little time to do the design work and get the materials and to implement it, because it was always meant to be seasonal, meaning that we were going to install it in August and it would have to be removed by November. So there were some technical challenges with just that alone. But the outreach and engagement because of the pandemic wasn't really allowed to happen in the way that we had always envisioned, which would have been much more door-to-door individual conversations with business owners and property owners on the high street to adjust and accommodate some of their concerns and needs in the design. And to actually just fully explain, like, this is coming, it's not permanent, it's going to be removed. This is why we're evaluating it for this much bigger investment, which is coming in 5 years' time. Long story short, the business owners hated the project. And so it actually got removed much faster than we had hoped for because of the public response. And the pressure on the mayor was that the community thought it was a misuse of funds, even though it wasn't city funds, it was state funds. And the communication we were meant to have was unable to happen because of the pandemic. And because of that, it failed. And so it's a threat to the long-term vision and project that actually is funded by the state to spend millions of dollars to reconstruct the high street. So the long-term story, the lesson there in such a long story is that, no matter what, that engagement really does matter. Of course, that's difficult and challenging during these times, but it's a reminder that you can have the best design, you can have all the funding that you need, you can have commitment from the city hall and the mayor and political support, but on the ground, if you don't actually do that hard work of door-to-door outreach, then the outcomes can be poor.
That's really interesting to hear, and really useful to hear how key community engagement is, and how things can sometimes run kind of counterproductive without predicting so. So following on from that, what do you think are some of the kind of really key ingredients to the success of a tactical urbanism project? So whether also maybe there are ways that local councils can help to create a culture which supports tactical urbanism projects. I know you mentioned that briefly at the beginning of the interview.
I think a lot of it is communication, knowing what it's for, what it is, how long it will be there, and then how it's being evaluated, and then being able to share that back with the community. That sort of level of transparency in the communication is really important to the success of projects. So that's definitely one. Another is materially, it's always helpful when the design is beautiful. If you can get away from just using, traffic control related materials to using things that are more artistic, that are green, that are a pleasure to experience, or at least interesting and can raise questions in the experience, and that can really help with the engagement. If something looks too much like a construction site, then people just have a negative reaction to that, even if there's benefit being conferred to people on the street in terms of safety or access. So the aesthetic of the projects can really be make or break for success on whether or not communities want to go to the next level with it. I think those are two kind of key things that we learned in the past decade.
Thanks, that's great lessons to take forward. So the final question is, as you know, placemaking is really important at the community level and people can learn a lot from those around them. But what it would be great to see in the future is people from kind of international communities coming together to share this wealth of knowledge and the lessons they've learned. And I'm interested in what you see as the potential opportunities if there was more kind of international collaboration and sharing of knowledge around tactical urbanism and not just such a local focus.
I think there already is a community of that happening. We've got, if you're on social media, it's a very active space with the tactical urbanism hashtag, other Facebook groups that are oriented towards tactical urbanism, and of course just professional practice that gets disseminated around the globe through conferences and things like that. So there's a pretty, I'd say, professionalized ecosystem. I think it would be one area for growth and evolution is to get much more of the basic knowledge into the hands of just everyday people in a way that empowers them to think about how they can impact their city in a positive way. If not their city, at least their neighborhood, and then share that internationally. So, we've definitely worked with a number of NGOs across the globe who have taken the idea, adapted it, and tried to make sure it can, tactical projects can happen in India, in South America, in Italy, in Australia, New Zealand. There's a lot of that's happening, and it's taken several years for it to take root. But if you start to look around, the practice is definitely growing internationally, probably even faster than here in the States at the moment, since it was kind of established quickly in the States and maybe is more at a plateau versus other countries are really identifying this as maybe a key part of their ways to do community building in the future.
Yeah, it's really exciting to hear how much of a kind of global network there is. I've been really aware on Twitter, searching the hashtag tactical urbanism. There's so many interesting projects on such different scales, like you're saying, very small projects and kind of big council-run projects. So what we're doing at the end of February is having a free festival, which is activism-led, volunteer-led, and we're trying to bring people together to think about tactical urbanism. Just wondering if there would be a piece of advice you might be able to give people who'll be participating in our workshops, many of whom will be at the very start of their journey with tactical urbanism, might not have heard about it ever before the workshops we're doing. So if there's one piece of advice you'd give people.
Have fun. It's meant to be fun, right? This is about being together in our communities. It's not something where you should get too hung up on all the technical details of something as you're just starting out with tactical urbanism. You should think about, where is their need and how can I help fill that need in my community? And how do I do that, collectively with neighbors and with city leaders? And that's really a key part of the whole movement, is to do that and have fun.